When the room turns against you, decide what cannot be taken. Your meaning, your name, your final sentence. Let them have what they can carry. Keep what they cannot. I was not undone by love. I was undone by a machine that needed a lesson. They say my beauty brought empires to their knees. A flawless face was the perfect disguise for a lethal mind. I am Cleopatra, the seventh Theophilopator, and this is my autobiologue. You have inherited a story about me, a story of silk and seduction, of a queen undone by love, of a woman who wept her way through history and then died beautifully for a man. That story has circulated for 2,000 years. It is interesting. It is also not mine. Consider this. The men who wrote it were not present. Plutarch composed his account approximately 120 years after my death. 120 years? A man writing today about events from 1906. He worked from sources that no longer exist, filtered through a Rome that had already decided what I needed to mean. And before Plutarch, there was Octavian. Because every story requires an author, and Octavian required a monster. Not a capable administrator who controlled the Eastern grain supply and outnegotiated two of Rome's most powerful men for 21 years. A monster. An Eastern seductress who had bewitched good Romans away from their virtue. That story justified an empire. Therefore, that story was told. I will not pretend to be wounded by this. Falsified ledgers do not wound the treasurer. They require correction. You ask about love. I will ask about grain. One of these fed Alexandria. The other fed a myth that served Octavian very well indeed. Begin where power is decided. Begin inside the palace. My father died in 51 BCE. He left me a kingdom and a co-ruler. The co-ruler was 10 years old. Consider this. A 10-year-old king does not command guards. He commands nothing. Whoever commands the guards commands the seal. Whoever commands the seal commands the decree. Therefore, who ruled Egypt? 3 men understood this before the body was cold. Pothinus, a regent, which is to say a ruler wearing a subordinate's title. Achilles, a general, which is to say the man whose soldiers stand between the seal and anyone who disputes it. Theodotus, a rhetor, which is to say the man who teaches a child king what to think before the child can think for himself. A regent, a general, a rhetor, 3 functions. Together they equaled a throne. I will not pretend this surprised me. What surprised me would have been incompetence. These men were not incompetent. Over 2 years, they redirected the administration. Petitions rerouted, guards reassigned, seals were cut. None of it dramatic, all of it exact. By 49 BCE, I was no longer inside Alexandria. I was on the Syrian frontier, raising forces, reading dispatches, and calculating what lever remained available to me. If you doubt it, look at the method. They did not need to imprison me. They only needed to make me irrelevant to the daily operation of the state. Displacement does not require chains. It requires paperwork. The mechanism is this. The Nile does not flood because I am queen. It floods because it floods. My administration exists to ensure that when it does, every measure of grain reaches the ledger before it reaches the black market. First, the flood arrives. Scribes in every nome measure the water level and report upriver to Alexandria. Not poetry, numbers. Second, the harvest follows. Royal granaries receive their portion before any private merchant touches a single bushel. This is not greed. This is the chain. Third, The harbor, the lighthouse of pharaohs, does not exist to guide sailors home out of kindness. It exists because we control what enters and what leaves. Ships loaded with Egyptian grain make Alexandria necessary to Rome, to Athens, to every city that cannot feed itself. A harbor is a lever. The lighthouse is the hand on that lever. Fourth, taxes flow from export revenue into the army's wages. The army maintains order. Order protects the fields. The fields protect the flood. The flood begins it again. Temple networks sit alongside all of this, not above it. Priests confirm the queen's legitimacy in the language the people trust. I did not invent this. I used it because it worked. Now apply it. A hungry city does not ask who is legitimate. It asks who has bread. Therefore, legitimacy is a granary problem. What is a crown when the granaries are thin? It is decoration. Then Rome's civil storm touched our shore. Consider this. In 49 BCE, Caesar and Pompey were not simply two generals quarreling over rank. They were two competing claims on every resource Rome had extended credit against. Egypt carried debt to Roman financiers. Our grain fed Roman legions. Our harbor was the hinge on which Mediterranean trade turned. There is no neutral position when you are the hinge. Pothinus and his faction understood this in their way. They ran the calculation. Pompey is losing. Caesar is winning. Therefore, Caesar must be pleased. Therefore, Pompey must not reach Egyptian soil alive. The arithmetic was correct. The timing was not. Caesar arrived before the body was cold. What he needed was a client Egypt that was orderly and grateful. What he found was a court that had just murdered a Roman consul on a beach. That is not an alliance. That is a liability. Pothinus calculated correctly. He simply miscalculated what Caesar would need to see when he arrived. Can a port city pretend it is an island? It cannot. The ships make that impossible. The tribute ledgers make that impossible. The envoy reports already sitting in Caesar's hands made that impossible. A Roman arrived, not as a guest, as weight. Weight lands differently when it carries 4,000 soldiers and a debt claim on your treasury. Caesar did not arrive as an admirer. He arrived as a creditor, an arbitrator, and a general without a war to finish. Egypt owed Rome a sum that had accumulated across my father's reign. Patronage purchased on account, interest compounding. He had come to collect stability, if not coin. My brother's faction controlled the palace approach. They had already moved to frame the arbitration before I could speak inside it. Therefore, the question was not whether to reach Caesar. The question was how to reach him before Achilles' men made that impossible. It is said I arrived in a carpet. The record is thin on the prop. What is not thin? I arrived before my brother's men could prevent it. That is the detail that mattered. Caesar's stakes were these: grain routes secured, the debt resolved or deferred, and a base in the eastern Mediterranean that did not require a siege to hold. My stakes were exact. His army between me and Achilles' sword. His arbitration before Ptolemy Roman 13 could manufacture a decree I could not answer. This is not romance. This is a ledger with two columns. He arbitrated in my favor. Ptolemy Roman 13 rejected the ruling and moved his army toward the palace. That decision began the Alexandrian War. Not my arrival, not any carpet, not any private arrangement. A boy king's refusal to accept arbitration he had already agreed to enter. On the matter of Caesarion, he was never named in Caesar's will. I am aware of this. His blood was useful as claim. Its legal standing was always mine to manage, not his to grant. Do you think alliances run on romance or accounts? But arithmetic sometimes becomes fire. In this case, it became ships burning in the harbor of Alexandria. Caesar was besieged in the royal quarter. His fourth-hidden troops held a perimeter measured in palace corridors and waterfront walls. The harbor chain was the contested line. He ordered ships burned to prevent them reaching Ptolemy Zirai's forces. Some structures on the waterfront, the record is not precise on the extent, may have caught. Burn ships in the harbor, and you buy time. You also lose the harbor. Temporarily, Caesar understood the trade. So did I. Reinforcements reached Caesar from the east. Ptolemy Roman 13 moved his army to the Nile crossing and did not survive it. His body was recovered. His golden armor was displayed. Factional resistance requires a visible end that was the end. I will not pretend the months of Roman soldiers occupying my palace quarter were without cost. The harbor was disrupted. Warehouses were damaged. Pay chests moved under armed guard. Months of instability charged against a ledger that had barely recovered from the previous debt. When the harbor is disputed, who rules the city? No one. That is the answer. A disputed harbor is a city bleeding from its own throat. Victory buys time. Rome always sends a bill. Rome sends a bill in coin. It also sends one in exposure. Caesar housed us across the Tiber, outside the city proper, which told you precisely how much Roman law was prepared to accommodate an Egyptian queen with a child of contested Roman paternity. The villa was adequate. The position was deliberate. Caesar placed my image in the temple of Venus Genitrix. Rome was offended. Good. Offended cities do not overlook you. That statue was not vanity. It was Caesar broadcasting alignment to every senator who passed through that precinct. I was the signal. He was the sender. Cicero wrote about me with considerable distaste. He read the provocation correctly. I will grant him that. A foreign queen installed in a Roman temple is not a diplomatic courtesy. It is a claim. My brother Ptolemy Roman 14 died. In 44 BCE, Caesarion became co-ruler. In an enemy city, what does safety cost? In Rome, visibility. Constant, controlled, expensive visibility. Every envoy letter logged. Every public appearance measured. Every patron relationship maintained at precise distance. Then the knife fell on Caesar and on every guarantee he carried. The knife on the IDs of March did not fall on Caesar alone. It fell on every arrangement he had sealed. I returned to Alexandria. Spring, 44 BCE. The sea crossing was calm. The numbers waiting for me were not. Caesar's will wrote Octavian's name, not Caesarian's. I did not read that as tragedy. I read it as data. In Rome, power flows toward the name on the page. In 43 BCE, the second triumvirate formed: Antony, Octavian, Lepidus. 3 men trying to carry the weight one man had held. Each had legions. None had Caesar's unity. That meant a gap inside Rome, and a gap is bargaining. We watched, we measured. By 42 BCE, on the road to Philippi, both sides asked for the same things: grain, ships, supply. And I did this. I kept Egypt at the table, but in no man's pocket. Because the moment you are owned, you are occupied in all but name. The result was plain. No Roman boots stood on Egyptian soil. That was not luck. That was accounting. When the guarantor dies, what survives of the pact? The ledger survives. The ledger always survives. So I reached for the next lever in Rome's machine. The next lever was Antony. And Antony required a different instrument than Caesar had. First, I was summoned to Tarsus to answer for alleged support of Cassius. Notice what that framing cost Antony before I arrive. A queen who travels to answer charges is diminished. Therefore, do not answer the charge. Answer the question behind the charge. The question behind the charge was this: Does Egypt have resources Antony needs? And will those resources come with a ruler he can work with? That was the negotiation. The charge was the pretext. Second, the arrival. It is recorded, through Plutarch writing well after the event and drawing on earlier accounts, that the arrival was staged. I will not dispute this. It is said the harbor stopped working when the ships came in. Good. A harbor that stops is a harbor that remembers. Spectacle is not decoration. It is the opening position of a negotiation, made visible before a word is spoken. Antony needed grain, ships, and Egyptian treasury to fund the Parthian campaign. I needed his army positioned between Egypt and Octavian's expanding reach. The arrangement was exact. Both columns balanced. He married Octavia. This was politics. I waited. What is spectacle, if not policy made visible? But Rome turns spectacle into a weapon. Rome turns spectacle into a weapon by building a better story and reading it aloud before yours is finished. In 34 BCE, at Alexandria, I named what I intended to construct. Caesarion declared legitimate son of Caesar. Children given territorial authority over regions of the East. My own title, Queen of Kings. Some of that territory was not yet held. Octavian understood immediately. This was not a ceremony. It was a map of what Rome stood to lose. He moved with precision. Antony's will obtained, he claimed, from the Vestal Virgins read before the Senate. The contents may be genuine. The timing was not accidental. A man who wishes to be buried in Alexandria is a man who has changed his allegiance. That is the charge the will was made to carry. Then the declaration of war. On me, not on Antony. Consider this carefully, because it tells you everything about Octavian's method. A foreign war has no Roman dead. A civil war has fathers. He chose wisely. Rumor becomes law when spoken in a Senate chamber. Law becomes morality when repeated in the forum. Morality mobilizes armies. This is how a story recruits soldiers. Whoever controls the story recruits the soldiers. Then came the test no speech can soften, the sea. The sea at Actium did not break us. What broke was the structure underneath it. Let me be exact about what happened on the 2nd of September, 31 BCE. Antony's Parthian campaign in 36 BCE had already cost 20,000 men and supply credibility. In the weeks before the engagement, Agrippa had cut the coastal supply lines. We were provisioning a fleet from inside a shrinking perimeter. The fleet was adequate. The treasury was with me. The battle plan was withdrawal, and we executed it. What Actium proved is that a fleet executes orders. Allies recalculate. Ahenobarbus left before the engagement. Delius, who had sat at my table at Tarsus, left before it. Herod of Judea had already transferred his allegiance to Octavian. The mechanism is this. When a patron begins to lose, the calculation shifts. Each man reads the same ledger and reaches the same conclusion independently. This is not treachery. This is arithmetic. What breaks first, the fleet or the will behind it? You ask me to grieve the ships. I can account for ships. What I cannot enter in any ledger is the moment a man looks at two sides and chooses the living one. After Actium, every day became an audit. After Actium, the audit ran in one direction: loss management. We were no longer counting expansion. We were counting what could still be kept. Octavian entered Egypt in 30 BCE. Alexandria's harbor did not produce resistance that mattered because the city had read the arithmetic before the army landed. People do not wait for the sound of war. They listen for the moment bread hesitates. Antony was given a false report of my death. He did what men do when they believe the account is closed. They brought him to the mausoleum still breathing. I will not ornament the scene. I will tell you only this. While they carried him, I had already begun the next negotiation. Because Octavian did not require me dead, he required me alive. A triumph needs a living centerpiece. That necessity was leverage. Briefly, I met it as leverage. I presented an inventory of the treasury to his representatives. I undervalued it on purpose. I was not hiding coin. I was buying time. A freedman in my household carried the correction to Octavian. I do not deny it. And I sent Caesarion east, toward the Red Sea, toward any distance that could still be called safety. His tutor was purchased. The boy was turned back. Octavian's calculus was simple. He did not fear the boy's sword, he feared the boy's name, because names are claims, and claims recruit men. Caesarion needed no army. His bloodline was an army's excuse. He was 17. If you must lose the city, what do you try to save? The world prefers the answer treasure. That is only half. I tried to save the account, not the coin. The account of what Egypt was, what it fed, and what I had administered. And then the ending people demand. Simple, theatrical, clean. The ending people demand is simple. A basket, a snake, a queen, a death that fits the drama they have already decided upon. Let us speak plainly. Here is the detail they cling to, the instrument. Roman writers worry at it. One claims marks, another doubts. Let them. I did not leave them a tidy prop. I left them a closed door, because the instrument was never the point. The point was this: Octavian needed me alive. A Roman triumph requires a body to parade, not a corpse, but a living queen in chains. I studied his requirements carefully. I declined to meet them. So I chose the symbol Rome could not cheapen, the asp. The cobra is pharaonic authority, set on every crown, carved on temple walls, the sign of protection and sovereign right. If Rome insisted on a scene, then I insisted on a meaning. I issued my last decree with my own body. I died as Pharaoh, not as spectacle. He carried my image instead. In chains, it was a portrait. He knew the difference. So did Rome. My daughter Cleopatra Selene walked in that procession and survived it, and ruled Mauritania, and named her son Ptolemy. The account does not end in the mausoleum. It continues in every direction he could not close. Is a ruler defeated when the city falls, or when the story is stolen? He took the city. I kept the story. You are still telling it. Hear me. They will always try to reduce you to a prop and ornament in someone else's victory. Do not give them the prop. Do not make their version easier to tell. Power is not only what you hold, it is what you refuse to perform. When the room turns against you, decide what cannot be taken. Your meaning, your name, your final sentence. Let them have what they can carry. Keep what they cannot. I was not undone by love. I was undone by a machine that needed a lesson. Fine. I learned the machine. And I left it one problem it could not solve: a woman who would not appear where she was required. So remember this. If you remember anything, do not die the way your enemies planned. Write the ending they cannot use.